So again, thank you to all of you for coming. I always like to start by asking how many people are here for the first time in one of these form-based code meetings? A couple, we always have a few. A few more this time. Okay, well great, welcome, we're glad you came. So I'm going to give just a very brief overview about form-based codes in general. What are they? Why do we need it in the downtown? And then we'll get into some of the more specifics. For those some of you guys standing, there are plenty of chairs scattered around. Feel free to come up and grab one. So we'll go do the brief overview first, and then the other topics we're going to talk about today are parking and access, landscaping, and signage. And then we'll wrap up with a quick discussion about what's happening next and what is the schedule going to be like going forward. If I could get you to hold any questions until the end of the presentation, that would be great, just out of courtesy to those who maybe are just here on the lunch hour and need to scoot back to work. We don't want to keep anybody right in here any more than 45 minutes to an hour. But again, the staff will be around all day, so we'll be glad to stick around and answer any other questions you may have. Okay. I'm also fighting a sore throat, so excuse me if I stop to drink coffee a lot. So form-based code, what is it? It's really a tool that we're proposing to use to basically regulate new development in the downtown area. You know, places throughout the downtown are all different. The urban area, the downtown is very different from the East Brainerd area. They look very different. And one of the problems with our current zoning that we've been using for decades is that it's kind of a one-size-fits-all, and it's really geared to that suburban development. It's geared to the East Brainerd's and the Hickson areas in the town. And there are all these zones in our ordinance that apply to that type of suburban development, where the buildings are set back far from the street, all the uses are kind of separated. And we only have a couple zones that we can use in the downtown, in the urban area, and they don't work real well, to be honest. We've kind of cut, pasted, and bandaged them over the years. So that's really what we're trying to do here, is come up with some zones that work well for the downtown and kind of add them to our palette of zones to pick from in the future. As we look at the downtown area, and as we've had visioning sessions over the past 10, 15 years even, people always tell us a lot of the same things, that as downtown continues to grow and redevelop, they want it to be urban. They don't want it to look like the suburbs. They want development to be of a high quality. They want it to be walkable, safe. They want it to be attractive. They want a mix of uses. And so those are the types of things we're trying to accomplish with this code. And again, unfortunately, the current zoning that we've been working with for a long time really doesn't help us achieve that vision very well. This is a map of the area where we're going to apply the form-based code. I know it's a little difficult to see, but we have lots of much larger maps on the other side of the glass. Feel free to stick around and look at those if you have a question about the boundary. But it's going to be applied to the North Shore, to the riverfront, to the city center, to the M.L. King neighborhood, and to the Southside neighborhoods. Okay, so what are some of the differences between what we have now and what we're proposing in the downtown, and how is it going to be the same? First of all, a form-based code, despite the rather strange name, is just zoning. It's just a little different type of zoning, again, that works better in an urban area. So don't let the name throw you off. Currently, with our existing zoning, it focuses about 80% on the use of your property, whether it's commercial or residential or industrial, those sorts of things, and only about 20% on the form of the buildings. So things like how tall your building is or how far it sits back from the street, that sort of thing. A form-based code tends to flip those percentages. So it tends to focus more on the form of the buildings, and it still looks at use, but to a somewhat lesser extent. And if you think about a downtown area, we think that intuitively makes a lot more sense. We have buildings that have been with us in the downtown for 100 years. And the uses inside those buildings have continued to change over the years. So we want to be flexible when it comes to the types of uses you can have inside the building. But again, hopefully the buildings we build are going to be with us a long time, so we want to get the buildings right to start with. So that's kind of the idea behind this form-based code. It focuses more on that physical form of the buildings and how they fit in with what's around them. But again, keep in mind it's just zoning. I know it's a big change, it's a pretty big area we're taking on, but it is just zoning. So as we've been working on this code for the past year, we started with a number of principles that we took from many of the visioning sessions that some of you have probably attended over the years, things that people were things that people were telling us they wanted to see in the downtown. And so I want to quickly go through these principles because they kind of set the stage for everything we're doing. So again, first of all, we want to maintain a safe, walkable, attractive downtown, especially along the street. I mean, whether you're walking or in a car or on the electric shuttle or on a bicycle, that's kind of where most people experience the downtown, is along the street. Another thing we want to do is maximize the opportunity for new development. We want to continue to see some new development come into the downtown area, especially in the core of downtown, where you've got more opportunity for some taller, bigger buildings. We also want to provide a diversity of housing, not just in the downtown, but throughout the city. We've done a number of studies in the past couple of years looking at our projected population growth throughout this area, and this area is growing. It's also becoming more diverse. We're getting a lot more younger people moving back into the city, and a lot of the folks, especially the millennials, are preferring to live in an urban environment where maybe they don't have to have a car or drive to work every day, and they're close to the restaurants and theaters and things. So our population is changing, and we need to make sure that we can accommodate that population in the future. We also hear from people things like, I would love the electric shuttle to come to my front door, or why can't we have more transit service in the downtown, or we really want a grocery store in our neighborhood. We hear that one all the time. And until we get some more development and more actual people in the downtown, we're not going to get those things, because those things take a certain amount of people to be successful and to work efficiently. And so that's another reason behind this. Now those are probably some reasons why you might want to grow taller in the downtown or have more development. There are also some reasons to temper that growth a little bit. And this page gets to some of those. We have some existing single-family neighborhoods in our downtown, especially in North Chattanooga and the M.L. King neighborhood and the Southside neighborhoods. And folks like that lifestyle. They move there because they like living in the urban area, but they're like their little single-family neighborhood. And we've heard a lot from those people saying we want to protect that. We don't want a 5-story commercial building being built. I don't want that right next to my home. And I think that's a reasonable request. So we're trying to preserve those existing single-family areas pretty much intact, and also make sure the development that comes in near them is compatible with them, that development isn't too tall and overshadowing those neighborhoods. A similar thing with our historic districts. We have a number of national historic districts in the downtown. This area where we're in, just south of us, Market and Main, is one of those. There's one along M.L. King Boulevard. And if you look at the older buildings in those areas, they're mostly 2, 3, at the most about 4 stories. One or two are a little bit taller. And our economist on our consultant team has said, if preserving those historic buildings is important to this community, which people have told us it is, if that's important to you, you want to be careful not to overzone those areas. You don't want to zone them for 10-story buildings, because then that puts pressure on those properties. And what you have is somebody coming in, tearing down those old historic buildings in order to build something bigger and taller. So we've tried to be careful about that. We also have a river running through the downtown. A lot of folks have said, We want to, maintain views of the river. We still want public access to the river. We don't want things to be too tall on the riverfront. Some folks have said just the opposite. We would like taller development on the riverfront. So we've had some good discussions about that. But we're trying to balance that idea of more development versus preserving some of our open space in the riverfront areas. We also have some hills in the downtown and North Shore areas that we're having to contend with, so we've tried to be sensitive to that. Again, a lot of folks have told us that they don't like to see really tall buildings on top of our hills, so we've tried to kind of limit the number of stories on our hilltops. And then finally, we have a number of plans that have been adopted by the City Council over the years. Again, that a lot of folks in the community have participated in, and so we've been going back and looking at all those plans and trying to make sure we're not doing something that runs counter to any of the goals in those plans. Okay. So that's a quick overview. Now I'm going to kind of dive into some of the specific topics that we said we would cover today. First of all, parking and access. So the form-based code standards really covers 3 different modes of travel. It talks about standards for vehicles and where you park them, how you park them. It has some standards in there for bicycle parking, and it also has some standards in there for pedestrian access. So those are the kind of 3 modes of travel that we'll talk about. The standards for parking and access, like all the other standards in the form-based code, only apply to new construction. So if you are building a brand new building, it will apply to you. If you are adding on to your building, it may apply to you. If you're increasing the size of your existing parking lot, it could apply to you, depending on how much of an increase it is. But if you have an existing building, you're not doing anything to change it, these standards do not apply. It's really only when you're doing something, when you're adding something, either more parking or a building addition or a new building, that these standards kick in. And we've even added some caveats to that. So say if you have an existing building and you're putting an addition onto that building, but it's less than 25% of your floor area, then these standards are not going to apply to the entire site. They'll only apply to that addition. On the other hand, if it's more than 25% of your building square footage or more than 25% of your parking area, then we're going to ask you to apply these standards to your entire site. That's kind of standard. A lot of cities do that sort of thing with their zoning. Okay, so before I launch into the specifics of the parking standards, I want to talk just a second about, again, the difference between urban and suburban when it comes to parking. If you just look at an aerial photo of the 2 areas, this is kind of the Market and Main area on the left and Hamilton Place on the right. It's probably a little hard to see, but they're very different. I mean, at Hamilton Place, you have buildings that are kind of separated from each other with lots of parking around it. In downtown, buildings are much closer together. You've probably got smaller parking lots scattered in between the buildings, but it just looks different. And so we're trying to consider some of the differences. Something else to think about when it comes to parking requirements for a downtown area versus a suburban area is in downtown you have a lot of other options. In downtown you tend to have multi-level parking garages available in some places. Right now we don't have probably not any of those hardly in the suburban areas. We may eventually, but we don't right now. In the downtown area, again, you have more transit services. You've got other ways for people to get around, or they can park their car once and then get on the electric shuttle or a bus and ride around. We've got a bike share program in the downtown that people are using more and more. We have on-street parking in the downtown that you don't tend to have in the suburbs. So a lot of those things make parking requirements different in the downtown area. And so when we look at how much parking is going to be required for new development, we want to take all of those things into account. Again, also remember that our very first principle was we want an attractive, safe, walkable environment. And if all you have is surface parking lots lining all of our streets, that's not a very attractive environment to be in. So keep that in mind as we're looking through this. And by the way, the red oval up there is the Carter parking garage down by the choo-choo. So again, you know, we've got some other options in the downtown area. Okay, so typically in a zoning ordinance, you have some minimum requirements for parking if you're building a new building or adding on to your building. And in this new code, the way it's going to work is if you are adding 10,000 square feet or more to a building, or if you're building a new building that's 10,000 square feet or more, or say if it's a residential building and you're building at least 10 residential units, you're going to have to submit a parking plan to the city staff. They're going to sit down with you and they're going to look at all those things I just mentioned. You know, is there a public parking garage right across the street or next door to you? Do you have some on-street spaces that are adjacent to your lot that you can use? Have you worked out some agreement to share parking, maybe with a use next door? Maybe you have a restaurant that's only open in the evenings and they have an office building that really just needs parking during the day, so maybe it's convenient for you to share parking. How big is your building going to be? How many residential units are you going to have? Those sorts of things. And they're going to sit down with you and figure out how much parking they think you need. Again, it's different throughout the downtown area. Some places have a public parking garage really close, for instance. Other places don't. And so we don't want to apply standards that are the same all across the board, but want to give people a little bit of flexibility there. On the flip side of that, we're actually going to have some parking maximums in this code. Now this is a little different. We currently don't have this. A lot of cities are going that way. In fact, we were just looking up yesterday a number of cities that have actually started doing this, and it's probably a growing list, I would say. Again, we don't want to fill the entire downtown with surface parking lots. It's not a very pleasant thing to walk past all those surface parking lots. Since occasionally, this doesn't always happen, but occasionally folks come in and they just want to, pave the entire lot for parking, whether they really need all of it or not. So we're instituting some parking maximums. And you can tell it looks like we've changed those up here on the screen. We did. We just noticed there was a mistake in there in our draft that's on the website, so we've changed that. So if you have a copy of the draft code that you've been looking at off of the website, you might just want to make a note of those first three items up there. The numbers have changed. So again, that's the idea behind the maximums, is we don't want to oversupply the downtown with parking. Loading zones. This one is something I think that we've had a lot of complaints about over the years in the downtown. We've had issues with the loading zones, and so we decided we needed to address that in this new code. In fact, I don't think he's here, but I had someone that's been involved in this process call me a couple days ago, and he's like, "Oh, thank you for including some standards for loading zones, because it's been an issue in his neighborhood." So we hope this will help. First of all, obviously, we don't want you to just have truck loading anywhere in the downtown. So we want it to be in designated areas, especially if you have an alley. That's kind of the perfect place to do loading. You can't just park a truck that's loading stuff right on the sidewalk. If you're building a new building, we're going to ask, and you might need loading zones, we're going to ask you to incorporate that behind your building instead of in front of it. Another issue or a conflict that occurs sometimes is when we have residential development right next to commercial development. A lot of times the residents are bothered by the noise of the loading in those commercial businesses. Maybe they're coming in the evenings, or when the truck's backing up, they're hearing that beep, 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 and it's bothering them. So we're saying that we don't want loading zones within 500 feet of residential development, at least not at the street level. So those are some of the things we're looking at there. I should also say here, I should have said this at the beginning, this code is still in a draft form. We're still making changes to it. That's why we've invited everybody here, is to hear your comments, hear your questions if you have any concerns. So if any of this that we're going through today doesn't quite ring true to you, you think there's an issue with it, or if it's something you've read in the code, please let us know. Please fill out one of the comment cards before you leave, because we're going to go back and keep looking at that. None of this is carved in stone until it's adopted by the city council. Bicycle parking. We've put a lot of emphasis on bicycles in our community in the last couple of years, and so we've included some standards for bicycle parking for new development. Both short-term and long-term bicycle parking. Short-term is, you know, if you're just going to run in the bank or the post office, or you're just going for dinner somewhere, it's where you'd have, you know, a parking rack out on the sidewalk. Long-term is more for places like maybe an office building like this one, or a residential building, where folks are maybe riding their bicycle and they need a more permanent place to store it. So that would need to be maybe inside the building or covered in a place where they could lock up their bikes. So I won't go through all the specifics of this, but similar to car parking, there are some standards for bicycle parking, depending on the type of use and the size of your building and that sort of thing. And then finally, pedestrian connections. Again, we want downtown to be a very walkable, pedestrian-friendly area, so there are some standards in here for the width of sidewalks. Obviously, we already have sidewalks in the downtown, but say you're building a new building, the sidewalk needs to be replaced. We want those standards to be in here so everybody knows what they are up front. If maybe you have an existing building and you just want to add some an outdoor cafe in front of your restaurant, say, we're going to need to take a look at these standards and just make sure there's still enough room for pedestrians to get by on that sidewalk. So it's kind of common sense kind of things. ADA compliant just means it has to be handicap accessible. Another thing we're doing where it says paved, continuous treatment, if in some cases driveways in the downtown do cut across our sidewalks, so we just want to make sure that those sidewalks are marked in a way where maybe the paving is the same. In this case, you've got a brick pattern in the pavement, so that when pedestrians are walking, it's a little safer for them. Because if you're in a car, you kind of notice visually, oh, that's a pedestrian zone. I need to slow down and I need to be careful. So again, some kind of common sense things to make downtown more pedestrian friendly. Okay, landscaping. So why are we dealing with landscaping in the downtown? Well, we already have a landscape ordinance for the whole city, but again, it doesn't always work too well in the urban area. So the standards in here are a little bit different. Again, we want our streets to be very walkable and attractive. If you're walking past parking lot after parking lot, like you see up here with no trees or anything, it's not very pleasant, especially if it's 90 degrees outside and it's hot, there's no shade. That's really not what we want to promote in the downtown. Another issue with parking lots is stormwater. City of Chattanooga has a lot of issues with stormwater. We're spending a lot of money trying to solve some of those problems. And one of the big problems with stormwater management is we've paved over most all of the downtown, and all of that water that hits that pavement runs into the sewer system and ends up costing all of us a lot of money. So anytime we're building new parking lots in the downtown, we want to make sure we incorporate some landscaping that can help absorb some of that stormwater. Same reason we're encouraging people to put green roofs on top of new buildings. Again, it's a paved area that the water can't soak in and go into the ground. So these are the issues that we're going to talk about, or that are going to be covered in terms of landscaping. Just how it applies. We're going to look at buffers, parking lot screening, plant materials, and maintenance. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about this, but just talk a little bit about it. And really, you know, the type of thing we're trying to get to is when we have parking lots in the downtown, for instance, you know, we'd rather be walking past something that looks more like this than more so than what you see in this photograph. Just a little more pleasant. Okay. So, same as the other standards, if you're increasing your building 25% or you're increasing the size of your parking lot, by 25% or less, then these standards only apply to that addition. You don't have to apply it to the entire site. On the other hand, say if you're expanding your parking lot by more than 25%, we're going to ask you to landscape the entire parking lot. Also, again, going back to some of those conflicts between residential areas and commercial areas, if, say, you're building a new commercial building, has a commercial business in it, like you see right here, excuse me, that doesn't work, like you see here, and maybe there's an existing single-family home right next to you. We're going to ask you to put a landscape buffer between the two. Again, commercial businesses, sometimes have loading going on and maybe different lighting and things that can negatively impact those residential areas. So we want to just provide a landscape buffer between the two. And there's some standards in there that give you a couple options on the size or the width of that buffer. Obviously, we want you to put trees and shrubs and those sorts of things in that area. Okay, parking lots. We've been talking a lot about parking lots. Go into a little more detail here. So again, if you're adding on to your parking, existing parking lot by at least 10 spaces or more, then this starts to kick in. A couple standards that are included here for landscaping a parking lot. Well, you're going to need to put in interior islands. And when we talk about interior islands, those are basically the little landscaped islands at the end of each parking row. Usually has a tree or two in it. And that's what we're talking about. So for every 7 parking spaces you have, you're going to need to put in one of these islands. Basically, that's actually a little less than what we've been requiring in the downtown under some of our existing C3 zoning conditions. But then we're putting some more things in there too. If you have a pretty large parking lot where you've got multiple rows of parking, then we're going to say every 4 rows, we're going to ask you to put in a median between the cars that kind of runs along the length of the aisle with some trees and plantings in there. Again, all these are opportunities to put in some shrubs and things that will help absorb some of that stormwater in addition to providing some shade in the area. And then along the streets or along the perimeter of the parking lots, we're going to ask you to put in basically a buffer there to kind of shield the parking from folks walking down the street. And in all these, we give you some options for how wide that parking, or excuse me, those buffers or screening areas can be. We tell you the types of, the size of the trees. We prefer some taller shade trees, but what we call class 1 shade trees. But oftentimes in the downtown, we have overhead power lines in the way. So there's options to put in smaller trees if that's the case. So we're trying to be flexible with this. Screening. Okay, a little different here. When it comes to things like dumpsters, mechanical equipment, that sort of stuff, again, it's not very attractive. Yeah, this is actually the North Shore. Some of you may recognize this. I don't mean to pick on these folks, but it's not the most attractive spot to put your dumpster, right on the street. So there's some standards in here for that. And again, these are pretty commonplace in most any zoning ordinance you look at these days in any city. If you have a service area or a dumpster, we're going to ask you to put a wall around it on 3 sides and then have a gate on the 4th side so people don't have to look at your dumpster as they're going by. If you have some mechanical equipment mounted on the side of your building, on the outside wall, we're just going to ask you to screen that. If you have equipment on the top of your roof, if it sticks up, say, above the parapet wall of your roof where people can see it, we're asking you to screen that. Same thing if it's on the ground. You know, there's a new restaurant going in the North Shore, in the Bridgeview building, right at the north end of the Market Street Bridge. You may have noticed they've got like a grease trap and something that they've had to put in, and it's right there at the sidewalk. I've been told they are going to put a little wall to screen it, but that's the kind of thing that we're talking about. Plant material, there's some guidance on the types of materials, again, the size and caliber of the trees that we want you to use, all that's included in here. And then finally, there's some standards in here about maintenance. If you go to the trouble and the expense of putting in trees and shrubs, obviously you don't want them to die within the year and then have nothing. So if that does happen, again, it's pretty standard. We're just asking you to go back in and replace them within 90 days, or if perhaps it's in the middle of the summer and you don't want to plant them in the heat of the summer, you want to wait a few months, we can extend that to 180 days. So again, similar to what we're already doing in the landscape ordinance that we have throughout the city, but just a few differences in the urban area. Okay, signage. I know I'm throwing a lot of numbers at you today, so forgive me if it's just kind of overload. Signage is going to deal with both building signs, signs that are actually attached to the buildings, as well as signs that are on the ground. So with building signs, there are some standards for the size of the sign. Basically, we're saying it at the ground level, again, where we want it to be very pedestrian friendly. You can have 1.5 square feet of sign for every 1 linear foot of the building length. I know that's maybe kind of hard to wrap your head around sometimes, but basically we just don't want, especially at the ground level, for signs to be huge, so we've limited that. If you're familiar with the North Shore C7 guidelines, Brooke and Terry can tell you that's basically the same standard that's in there right now, so we haven't changed that. Little projecting signs, the little signs that project perpendicular off the side of the building, same standard we've been using, 16 square feet. One thing we've added that we haven't had before is if you have a building that's more than 5 stories, or say it's an assembly building, something like the Trade Center here, or maybe an auditorium of some kind, we're going to allow you to put a sign up at the top level of the building, like you see up here at the top of SunTrust. And we're going to have some standards for that. Now, I will tell you, currently, in the draft code, it says 300 square feet as a maximum, and it's kind of a one-size-fits-all, and we've just been doing some studies and kind of drawing that out and scaling it, and we think we need to tweak that a little bit. 300 square feet is probably great on a 10, 12-story building, but on a 5-story building, it really looks out of scale. It looks big. So we're going to tweak that a little bit. So if anybody has any comments, thoughts on that, we would welcome those. Okay, where can you put your signs on the building? Well, if you have one of those little projecting signs that sticks out over the sidewalk, it's got to be at least 9 feet above the ground. Kind of common sense. You don't want people running into it, or if you've got some kind of equipment that's coming in, you don't want it banging into the sign. They're typically on most buildings, especially commercial buildings, kind of typical places where you put the signs, so we're giving you some guidance on where to put that. You can have window signs, but we don't want you to cover the entire window. In this code, we're not allowing signs on top of the roof. And there are really very few of those in the downtown. Most of them are like you saw in the SunTrust building. They're up near the top, but they're on the side. About the only ones on the roof are, I think, the Choo Choo has one and Warehouse Row. Those are kind of historic signs and buildings. But future buildings, we're saying no roof signs. How do you light your signs? You can use indirect lighting, where you've got maybe a spotlight on the building that shines down on the sign. If you have some of these signs like this one where the individual letters are illuminated, you can do that. Neon is okay. The one thing that we're trying to get away from, it's kind of, I don't know what the technical term is for these, but we're calling them internally illuminated box type signs. So the sign where the whole box, the whole sign is one big light. People have been telling us they don't want to see that. In fact, anytime we've seen a sign like that go up on a building in or near the downtown, our phone starts ringing and people start complaining about it. So we're trying to avoid those. Okay, so monument signs. If you need a sign that goes on the ground, say in front of your building, there's some standards for that. Very similar, this is something similar to what we've been doing in the Brainerd area. We've just instituted some new zoning out there. So there's some standards for the height of those signs, the width of them. Again, I'd love your feedback. Maybe some of you that have put signs in recently, if you think these numbers work, we're thinking we might need to tweak that just a little bit for the urban area. Location, obviously you don't want them right up on the street where they're going to maybe get hit by something. So you just have to pull them back a little bit. That's supposed to say 18 inches, not 18 feet. Sorry, I just now noticed that. No pole-mounted signs, you know, like you see in a lot of fast food places where the sign's up on top of a pole. Those aren't really appropriate in an urban area. The standards for lighting are exactly the same, just none of the internally illuminated box type signs. So again, kind of a lot of details, but I'd encourage you as you're walking or driving through the downtown, kind of look for these kinds of things. And I think you'll see that there really is a difference between the downtown and the suburbs and the type of character and environment we're trying to promote. Okay, so I've thrown a lot of numbers and things at you. Where we're going from here is on March 17th, the Regional Planning Commission is going to have a specially called meeting just to talk about this form-based code. It's going to be at 5:30. They're going to hold it in the City Council building at 1000 Lindsay Street. Usually the Planning Commission meets in the county courthouse up on the hill, but we're changing that because this is just a City of Chattanooga code. So if you're used to going to the Planning Commission to the courthouse, don't forget it's in a different place this time, at the City Council building. Again, that's going to be the public's opportunity to come in, ask questions, give comments, positive, negative, whatever, in front of the Planning Commission before we formally get into the adoption stage of this code. Then the Planning Commission is hoping to actually take action on this. The meeting on March 17th is just an opportunity to hear folks' comments, so they won't take any action that night. But then in April or perhaps May, depending on how the meetings go, they're hopefully going to come up with a recommendation on this code that they will then forward to the City Council the following month. We're hoping to get to City Council by May, but again, if we get just a lot of questions at the Planning Commission meeting, they may decide they need an extra month to talk about it and think about it. Same thing once it gets to the City Council. Even if we get to the City Council in May, they may want to take a couple months to chew on it and think about it and hear from more people. So that's why it's a little tentative, but we're shooting for hopefully getting it adopted early summer. I would say probably June would be the earliest adoption that you would see this go into effect. And then once this code is adopted, we're going to have a grace period. So if somebody already has a development project underway, for at least the first 90 days, we're going to let you use either the existing zoning or the new form-based code. So we're trying to be flexible with that. We do have a project website. If you haven't seen it yet, it's cha-fbc.com. I'd encourage you to take a look at it. As I said, we're recording these presentations. The presentations will all be on the website. The draft of the code, the entire document, and the maps that you see out here on the wall behind you are on the website, so take a look at that. Also, at any point, if you have questions, first of all, please do fill out one of the comment cards before you leave today if you have any questions. Or feel free to call me or send me an email. It may take us a couple weeks to get back to you because we're getting lots of questions from people. This is a lot to take in, but we will get back to you on that.